Welcome, dear students. Hope you are all safe and sound. Today we'll discuss the neoclassical period, the literature during this neoclassical era. The neoclassical period is also called as Age of Reason, is also called Age of Enlightenment because we find love for the classical ideals and classical literature during this period. This classical literature was revived during this period. After the Renaissance period, I hope you are thorough with the history, the timeline of different periods in the history of English literature, right? You have this Elizabethan era, Old English period, Middle English period, Elizabethan era, and the beginning with the Elizabethan era, we have the beginning of modern era. Elizabethan era, and after that we have neoclassical era, romantic era, Victorian era, and modernism. So that's a timeline. So after the Renaissance, which was a period of exploration and expansiveness, came a reaction in the direction of order and restraint. So, as you all know, Renaissance was also a revival of classical ideals and classical literature, right? There was a new love, like newly found love for classical literature during the Renaissance period. But when we come to neoclassical era, what attracted the neoclassical writers uh, was the order or the standard maintained during the classical period. The period is called neoclassical because its writers look back to the ideals and art forms of classical times, but the emphasis was on order and rational control rather than emotion and imagination, which was which were the chief features in Elizabethan literature during the Renaissance period. The classical ideals of order and moderation which inspired this period, its realistically limited aspirations and its emphasis on the common sense of society rather than individual imagination could all be characterized as rational, and hence it is called Age of Reason. The literature of this period was from the head and not from the heart. This is the dictum of that period. From the head, not the heart. The age of enlightenment has been crucial for developments and advances in human rights, education, and modern democracy. One of the principal objectives of this age of enlightenment was to rebel against authorities. They didn't accept what the monarchy, the law, the church presented as truth. They used their reason and logic, and hence this age is also called Age of Enlightenment. So when you are asked to write an essay on the Age of Enlightenment or Age of Reason or Neoclassical period, the answer is the same, but you have to give an explanation why that age is called Neoclassical period. Why that age is called Age of Reason? Why is it called Age of Enlightenment? The neoclassical poetry differs from that of the Elizabethan poetry, not only poetry, literature in general, in three ways. First, it is very formal, with its demand to follow exact rules. And secondly, it is artificial, polished, sophisticated, straightforward, dull, and lacks the creative liveliness of the Elizabethans. It was from the head, not from the heart. Thirdly, the chief poetic form is heroic couplet, which replaced the variety of forms in the Elizabethan era. During Elizabethan era, they experimented with meter, with rhyme scheme. They used blank verse, which gave um, this like gave freedom to explore anything and everything. But here the poetic form was constrained to heroic couplet alone. When we look at the poetry of Dryden and Pope, we can see that they chose a heroic couplet alone. This neoclassical period is broadly divided into three periods. Actually, it's the duration, it spans from 1660 to 1798. And from that, from 1660 to 1700, we have the restoration period, the restoration of monarchy, the period when monarchy was restored in England. That is also called Age of Dryden, because the dominant writer of that era was Dryden. Then from 1700 to 1745 is called the Augustan Age, or the Age of Pop. Augustan Age, because the name came from the Augustus Caesar who ruled in Greece. Because that yeah, during the Neoclassical period we have this revival of classicism, and from 1745 to 1798 the period is called the Age of Sensibility, and the main writer of this period is Dr. Johnson. So it is called Age of Johnson as well. So when you're writing an essay on neoclassical literature, you have to refer to all these three periods. But for short answers, if you are given a question for maybe about age of Johnson, then you need not write the entire thing. But for the essay, you have to go through all this, summarize the important points as well as the important writers and works of this period. The Restoration, or the Age of Dryden, from 1660 to 1700, takes its name from the restoration of monarchy in England. Charles II, as you all know, after Puritan era, Charles II resumed the throne, and the time of reason and tolerance over, they celebrated this, the time of reason and tolerance over religious and political passion. And that is reflected in the works of Dryden as well. Writing of this age, according to Dryden and others, should be well structured. Emotion should be controlled. The emphasis was on qualities like wit. This is in sharp contrast to the high seriousness and sobriety of the earlier Puritan regime. As you all know, Puritan era was an era when literature was not popular. People were punished if they wrote something. If they acted in a play, they were punished. Theaters were all closed. But during this Restoration period, the theaters were opened, and new dramatists appeared. John Dryden is the chief poet and dramatist of this era. Dryden identified himself with the official opinion and regards himself as a chronicler of this age. The tragic drama of this period was made up of heroic plays, or they are called heroic drama. So please note this for short questions: heroic plays or heroic drama, which became popular during this period. In such drama, in such plays, men were represented as splendidly brave, women wonderfully beautiful. There's a lot of shouting, screaming, a good deal of nonsense, and you have to note that all these plays are written in heroic couplets, and most of them were satires. The very fine example is Macflecknoe. The midwife placed her hand on his thick skull with this prophetic blessing, "Be thou dull." There is this element of satire in most of the works by Dryden. So when you look at this restoration theater, you have to restoration literature. You have to look at restoration theater also. Restoration plays like comedy of manners and comedy of and sentimental comedies, which were popular during this time. The first great age of English literary criticism is this age of Dryden, with his work Essay on Satire, where he states very clearly the purpose of criticism and literature. The purpose of literature is to give a picture of truth and imitate nature in the manner of ancient Greeks and Romans. It is very important because he talks about two things. He says that we have to write. The writers should write in the manner, or they have to follow the rules and the standards of the Greeks and Romans, the classical writers, and they need to imitate nature. And by nature, Dryden means human nature, not nature as Wordsworth or Keats or Coleridge represented. And it's not about that. He talks about human nature. Literature must satisfy the reason and not emotion and imagination. And he considered blank verse as disorder, so he insisted So he insisted on rhyming couplets or rhyme. Dryden's prose is very logical. He is never carried away by the sound of words or the lure of metaphor or simile, which was popular during the Elizabethan era and also in the next era, in the Romantic era also. We find there's a love for words and metaphors and simile and imagery. The Restoration era witnessed the life of very famous philosopher John Locke, who wrote on the government. And coming to the religious works, we have John Bunyan, who started writing during the Puritan era and continued to write during the Restoration period as well. And I hope you are familiar with the dream allegory by John Bunyan, that is Pilgrim's Progress, which is about a man called Christian who is traveling from the world to the eternal city. And the Augustan Age, which spans from 1700 to 1745, took its name from the Roman Augustan Age, which the leading writers of this period greatly admired its figures. The new Augustans drew parallels between the two ages and deliberately imitated their literary forms and subjects, their emphasis on social concerns, and their ideals of moderation, decorum, and urbanity. There was this love for town life during this period. The dominant writer of this period is Alexander Pope, who followed Dryden and used couplets in verse. He wrote his essay on criticism, which contains sayings often remembered today. For example, a little learning is a dangerous thing. There are many maxims that are popular from Alexander Pope's work. His delightful poem, The Rape of the Lock, takes a light subject and treats it as important. This Rape of the Lock, Macfleck, no, they are all mock epics. They are called mock epics. When you did the paper reading poetry, you might have come across all this, right? Epics and mock epics. So a light subject is treated as if it is very important. That is an example of mock epic. He also translated Iliad and Odyssey of Homer. His other famous works, like Essay on Man, shows his perfection of the heroic couplets. The new century threw aside the strange plots and ideas of heroic tragedy and turned to reasonable things. We have Daniel Defoe, who described the Great Plague of London in his Journal of the Plague Year. His Robinson Crusoe is a better and more famous book. This story is based on a real event. So, from this age on, we find the beginnings of novel. Novel is not fully developed at this point of time. It was during the Victorian time, it became very popular and developed. But here we find the beginnings in the writings of Daniel Defoe, Henry Fielding. We find the beginnings of novel, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. I hope you have read this book maybe in your school days. The greatest prose writer of the whole century is Jonathan Swift. He was a very great humorist and a bitter satirist. You can note that when you look at the genres which were popular during this period, you can find that satires occupied a predominant position. Swift's famous satire is Gulliver's Travels. It's in four books. As a story, it is popular with the young who usually read the first two books, Gulliver's Voyages to Lilliput, where people are very small, very tiny people, and Broadenbaum, where they are very huge giants. So it's actually a satire. The greatest novelist of the century is Henry Fielding. He started his novel writing career almost by accident. The masterpiece is Tom Jones. It has picaresque elements. We can say that that's the first picaresque novel. The theme of the journey occupies the greater part of this book, but it would be more accurate to describe it as a mock epic as well. Because the novel is in the process of developing. We appreciate Tom Jones for its boisterous humor, its good sense, and its vivid characterization. Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. Then coming to the age of sensibility, that is the age of Johnson. 1745 to 1798. The man whose personality seems to dominate the whole of Age of Sensibility is Dr. Samuel Johnson, who is famous for the Dictionary of English Language. He was a kind of literary ruler, giving judgments, evaluating our books and authors like a god, and giving verdicts. Oh, this is good. This is not good. Like he is a critic of that sort, and he writes in his work lives of poets with decision and clear expression. His own writings are less important than what he said, and a record of his conversations has been preserved in the Life of Johnson, written by James Boswell, which became popular later on. It's actually a biography of Samuel Johnson. Then a small comparison between Renaissance literature and neoclassical literature. The literature had been passionate, concerned with the relationship between man and man, man and woman, as seen from the viewpoint of feeling and emotion. This feelings, emotions, imagination predominated the literature of the Renaissance period. But in neoclassical era, feelings, emotion, and imagination were mistrusted. Feeling implied strong convictions, and strong convictions had produced a civil war and the harsh rule of the Commonwealth. Imagination suggested the mad and wild, the uncouth, the fanatical. So they went for a calm, civilized life governed by reason. Logic and reason were given importance. Such a life is best lived in the town, and the town is the true center of culture. This is a rise of town life. The country estates are impoverished, and little interest is going on there. The country itself is barbaric. So, compared to country life, people preferred this town life. Shakespearean nature pieces, poems smelling of flowers, so the telling of the shepherds, milkmaids, were not given importance. Themes of new literature are town themes, politics, the doings of polite society, the intellectual topics of men who talk in clubs and coffee houses. You need to look into that also. This rise of coffee houses, rise of periodicals. The heart is in complete control during the Renaissance period, but during the Renaissance, neoclassical era, the human brain has taken over and is in complete control. It's logic and reason, governed by logic and reason, not by passion and heart. They gave importance to good manners and wit. They do not speak their mind, but it was intellectual poetry. It's not from their heart. They spoke from their head. Literature is moving and emotional during the Renaissance period, but during the Neoclassical, it is neither moved nor moving. So, when you write an essay, please make sure that you make a comparison of these things as well. You have to look at the main themes of the neoclassical writers, the broad period of broad division that is possible about this neoclassical period and the important writers. So there is another lesson on neoclassical literature alone. Please look at that also, because you have to write the names of those poets and writers and their works as well when you write an essay on neoclassical literature. Hope it is clear. We'll have a discussion also. Thank you.